Hello, friends. My name is Michael Levine. Our partner for the expedition today is Stephen Mansfield, known by many as one of the great experts in the entire world on the life and times of Winston Churchill. We are going to go on one of the most fascinating journeys, fascinating expeditions that we've ever been on in the 10 years of Without Notes in reviewing the life of Winston Churchill. Friends, please join us on this most extraordinary journey we're about to take with Stephen Mansfield on the life and times of Winston Churchill. I promise you, you will not regret these precious moments. Now, dear Stephen, we must understand that there are people watching this show in all 50 states in America, 26 foreign countries of various ages, of various backgrounds. There will be people watching this show who are intimately aware of Winston Churchill and his great achievement, think he saved the world. There'll be other people who don't know who Winston Churchill is. So we have quite a journey to go on, but I want to start the journey with you, Stephen. Tell me, my friend, where were you born?
I was born in Columbus, Georgia, because my father was a military officer, and I was born at Fort Benning. Those who live near Columbus, Georgia, know that Fort Benning is there, and so born there, but quickly moved to Europe, where I spent most of my youth. My father was Special Forces and a Russian linguist and kind of a consummate Cold Warrior. And so we spent a lot of our lives in Germany and some time behind the Iron Curtain in Berlin while the wall was still up. So a very unusual upbringing.
Very unusual. And so your first language is English.
Yes.
And then when you travel to Europe, do you learn other languages?
I learned German well enough to date German girls when I was a teenager,
That's my
but
man.
that's there you go. That was my motivation. But of course, at the age of 18 or so, come back to the States and other than watching movies and occasionally traveling through Frankfurt Airport, never need German again. So I've lost a lot of it. But I have a German daughter-in-law and grandchildren, and so now I'm having to bring it back. My little grandchildren rebuke me for my bad German, so I'm getting it back.
Stephen, I'm inclined to, you and I reflect on the world today and the Germany of today. And of course, much of our lives, not all of our lives, but much of our lives, we lived with a divided Germany
Yes.
for reasons that, if you understand World War II, make maybe a bit more sense than to those who don't understand World War II. And then this seeming miracle happens where Germany becomes unified and the Soviet Union collapses. Now, were you, as an expert on the topics, surprised by that almost unbelievable set of occurrences?
I was deeply moved having lived there. I saw on the news reports the portions of the wall where I had actually stood
Right.
coming down quickly. I wasn't surprised that it happened. I was surprised by the speed of it. I think everybody, all experts, would have to admit they were caught off guard by the speed of it.
In New York just a short while ago, astonishing news from East Germany, where the East German authorities have said, in essence, that the Berlin Wall doesn't mean anything anymore. The wall that the East Germans put up in 1961 to keep its people in will now be breached by anybody who wants to leave. The East German media chief in the Communist Party said a short while ago that anyone who wants to leave East Germany and go anywhere in the world is free to do so. Anyone who wants to leave East Germany and travel to the West and return will need a visa, but visas will be granted, it is said, immediately or at least urgently by police stations all over the country. It is perhaps the most important announcement made in Central Europe since the end of World War II, certainly since the wall went up in 1961.
We now know it was actually a bit of a mistake on the part of the East German officials. They got their signals crossed from command and opened up the wall, and before long, West German and West Berliners began to pour in, and it came down almost overnight. But I wasn't surprised that East Germany and the Soviet bloc in that part of the world would fail. Having lived there, having studied it, it was a failed experiment. It was coming to an end. I think everybody knew that.
It
Who
was a
was an
matter
expert?
of time and
Yes.
the speed. Now, it reminds me, Stephen, of this incredible line in this novel, The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. And the line, of course, goes, talking about bankruptcy. How did this happen?
Yeah.
And the character says, two ways. First, slowly, then suddenly. And maybe
Exactly.
that describes so many aspects of life and Germany and all of it. First, slowly, then suddenly.
Well, when I was, picture me at 13 years old, I'm climbing up onto a platform right there at the Berlin Wall, looking east, looking west. You could see that the East wasn't working. You could see the
Yeah,
oppression
yeah.
on the faces of the people. You could see the dystopian feeling of the buildings and the streets and what have you. And then you'd look to the West, and God knows it wasn't ideal, but it was prosperous and happy and plump, and
One did not,
and
and one did not, if they were a child and looking at that, one did not need to be Freud or Einstein to feel like inevitably this is unsustainable.
Exactly. I'm 13. I have no sense of political theory. You just know this ain't working. That's the bottom line. This over here isn't working. And perhaps one of the most profound experiences of my life was spending the night, as teenagers do, with my teenage friends near the wall, nearer than my American sector home, and to hear gunshots at night, and to know that this was people trying to escape over the or through the no man's land to freedom. Well, nobody was going the other way. And so at the age of
Isn't
13, I
that
just knew
fascinating?
that there's the clock is ticking on this experiment.
Even what an interesting point. To all of those internal American critics, frequently on the left, who talk about the horror of America, the contemptible, criminal, racist, vile nature of this civilization. Isn't it fascinating that I don't see people trying to escape out?
Yes.
All the people escaping seem to escape in. Is that a coincidence, I wonder?
It's not.
Yeah,
It's not.
it's yeah,
And yeah, I know you're asking it for that response, but no,
yeah.
it's not at all. The nations that have immigration problems are nations that have institutions and a general culture of freedom that other nations want. They're escaping tyranny to come to freedom. And of course, we can be criticized. There are no perfect nations, there are no perfect leaders, there are no perfect people. But we have to humble up a little bit, stop our arrogant academic analysis, and realize that some of these nations are the best the world's ever seen in terms of providing happiness and opportunity for human beings. And that's why nations are flooding into England, into the United States, etc. And it's always been thus.
Stephen, I must tell you, I want to confess something to you, and then we're going to get to our topic of Churchill. And I want to see how you're going to react to this because it's a provocative way of phrasing something. When I currently, now we're taping this show in January of 2025. When I come across a particularly stupid notion, when somebody says something profoundly stupid to me, might be political, it might be business, it might, I don't know what it might be. It's just jaw-droppingly stupid. I assume as a given that the creator of the thought went to an elite university, right? And my logic is this. If you are a tenured professor at an elite university, you can believe that the world rotates on the back of a turtle and it will never impact your income or job status. You can tell the students the world rotates on the back of a turtle. If, on the other hand, you're a cab driver in Brooklyn and you believe the world rotates on the back of a turtle, you're going to get in a car crash, son. What's wrong with you? So, real life, I actually believe that there is more wisdom in the average plumber, cab driver, carpenter, common sense wisdom, common sense, than the tenured professors, elite universities. How do you respond to my wild remark?
Well, I could not agree with you more. I don't think there's much question that some of the most destructive ideas that have been belched out onto society have come from universities. Now, I speak as a man who has been on the faculty of universities, guest lectures at universities, loves the ideal of a university and university life. But you're right, the lack of market correction for ideas and for people who are at universities, the tenured professor who's crawled way up inside of his own head and is not in any way allowing fresh ideas. These ideas have damaged us. And you're exactly correct. Look at the
The
trends that are
only
shaping our
difference I
world, and there's just no question that if you track those ideas, they've spilled out of a university, and it's tragic in our time.
Stephen, I want to be open with you. We don't know each other very well, and I want to be open with you. The only difference I would have to what you said that some of the ideas that have flowed from the university, elite universities particularly, have damaged our society. That's your point of view.
Yes.
Mr. Levine takes a slightly contrary view and says, no, Stephen, it hasn't damaged the society. It's deeply damaged the society. You're being too kind.
I am being kind. I am being kind. And I'll tell you why.
A
Again,
kind person.
Thank you. Loving universities as I do, I realize the research in science and the good things that have come out of universities. Thank God for those laboratories and those research facilities and things of that nature. But in philosophy, in political theory, you're right. Just really, in many cases, a
Gender
cancer on society.
studies.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Here we go. Okay. Listen, we're here to talk about a serious matter and a serious matter.
Sir, I have myself full confidence that if all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, and if the best arrangements are made, as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once more able to defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war, and to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. At any rate, that is what we are going to try to do. That is the resolve of His Majesty's government, every man of them. That is the will of Parliament and the nation. The British Empire and the French Republic, linked together in their cause and in their need, will defend to the death their native soil, aiding each other like good comrades to the utmost of their strength. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it was subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, stepped forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old.
Once upon a time, I'm told, there was a man in England named Winston Churchill. He used to be in all the papers. And Winston Churchill can be recorded in many ways, and you'll talk about him in depth because you are one of the reigning experts in the world on Winston Churchill. But I think for the audience, it's fair to say that and you correct me on dates here, you're better at this than I, in 1939, 1940, there was but one man on the planet who was speaking in the most articulate and direct way imaginable against the voices of virtually everyone. And what this man, Winston Churchill, was saying is, ladies and gentlemen, this chap over in Germany, this gentleman, Adolf Hitler, number one, he's not kidding. Number two, he's up to really no good. And if we don't confront him, we will live to regret the day. And the world laughed. The world belittled and laughed. Take it from there, Stephen. The truth of that, the accuracy, the places I need some correction. Elaborate.
Yeah, I agree with you very much. Churchill wasn't alone in what he believed, but his life, his sufferings, his political failures, the bombardments he had taken in politics, his clarified view of the world caused him to arrive in 1940, understanding the world scene, gifted as a spokesman, gifted as a speechmaker, and he was often isolated in trying to warn the world about what's happening. And we know that appeasers abounded in the US, they abounded in England, they abounded throughout the world, and Hitler was on the march. And we should all, I think all lovers of freedom today, should be grateful that Winston Churchill stepped onto the world stage at the level he did in that time. He said at that moment, when he was appointed prime minister, I felt like I was walking with destiny, and that all my prior trials and tribulations were but preparation for this hour. And I think truer words were seldom said, and we should be grateful.
You know, there is I don't know how this remark has come about, but I'm sure you've heard it in social circles. You know, Stephen, if it weren't for Winston Churchill, we'd all be speaking German. And that's become a phrase heard and bandied about. And from your perspective, dear brother, is there some modest truth in that?
There is some modest truth in the sense that many nations would be speaking German that aren't speaking German now. Now, whether the United States would have been conquered by Germany is a matter of conjecture. It's not very likely, but we certainly could have been isolated. We certainly could have had a devastating war. And there's no question that Nazism would have covered Germany and much of the world, and we'd be in a very different world now. So it's an exaggeration that makes an important point, and that is a Nazi victory during World War II would have transformed the world in a vile, evil, dictatorial direction, and we'd be dealing with the consequences of it now. There's no question. And Winston
That's
Churchill was the primary voice against that happening.
yeah. All right, Stephen, I want to ask this. First of all, I was told my father was a soldier in World War II. Now, of course, that sounds a little heroic in certain ways, but people didn't have a choice at that time.
Sure.
Everybody goes. Now, this is hard to comprehend in contemporary American thinking. Listen to what I just said and confirm if you choose. Everybody goes. Senators' sons go, doctors go, millionaires' kids go, everybody goes. No exceptions. Now, yeah, I guess the exception at that time was women, but everybody goes. Second, when you entered the army, and everybody goes, you didn't have an 18-month plan. You were in for the duration of the war. What does that mean? You're in for as long as it takes. If it takes 50 years, you're in for 50 years. If it takes 10 years, you're in for 10 years. Duration of the war. And number three, Stephen, and these are all rich areas for you to comment on. In the first 2 years of the war, 40, 41, maybe even arguably elements of 42, the Nazis were winning. So if you were a soldier in 1941 or a general in 1941, things were not looking good for the Allies. So there was a we know how the story ended, but in 1941 or two, Hitler seemed invincible. So can you talk about these points, please, and elaborate?
No, I think you bring up a very, very important point, and that is that not only were recruits, so to speak, those enlisted in for the long haul, but this fight was considered to be so noble, I'll even use the word holy, that we now know that many, many young men who didn't qualify for health reasons for enlistment committed suicide. We're talking about American boys in American hometowns committed suicide because they couldn't deal with the shame of not being able to be part of this fight. And that also speaks to the
What a
spirit of the young.
changed world, Stephen.
Yes,
What a
yes,
changed world.
yes. And it also speaks to the spirit of these young warriors. They weren't exceptionally well trained. They too, like many today, were a generation away from military, the previous war and being in the military, having family members in the military. But when they went in for the long term, and it was devastating. We lost horribly in Northern Africa. England was being bombarded. We had, as everybody knows, I think, Rosie the Riveter symbolism of having to rev up our national production of war material. It was a devastating moment, and many people thought we would not win. People were preparing for us not winning. But the tide turned. It turned on the strength of American, just absolute business and production strength. It turned on the genius cluster. I call it a genius cluster of the generals and the leaders we had at the time. Thank God for Eisenhower. Thank God for Patton. Thank God for Marshall. I could go on and on. And we eventually turned the tide.
This was not a military, as best I know, and you can correct me here, that was obsessed with the fetish of pronouns and woke ideology. This was a military unit who saw its mission in a much more focused arena. Is that a fair remark, Stephen?
There's absolutely no question about it. And it marked a generation, that sense of whatever price has to be paid, we pay it. We do not ask for privilege. We do not ask for benefits. I'm fairly close to a lot of people in the Pentagon, and this recent woke trend where a general will have a junior officer sitting at his elbow telling him which pronouns to use for the sergeant walking in the office has caused a lot of our major leaders of this generation to walk away. It's completely opposite during World War II. My grandfather fought in World War II, served on the staff of MacArthur. And I remember even when I was, much as he loved me, when I was 15, if I complained or gave any reason I couldn't do something, he gave me a look of the ages, well, of utter disgust. Who are you? Don't you realize what you've been given by the warriors who have come before you? And I might have just have broken a pencil or done something, forgotten a chore, but it was a way of thinking of that generation, and it changed the world. I really do not object to them being called the greatest generation because they were amazing. And we have to remember they came off of farms. They came out of shops on the streets of New York. This was not a generation prepared for this in any way, but they did magnificent things.
Well, let's talk about our friend Winston. So Winston Churchill becomes prime minister in what I think is referred to, and again, you correct me here, you're the expert, I'm not, the darkest hour.
Yeah,
This is not a time in which maybe living at 10 Downing Street is the most enviable address in the world. Is that fair?
absolutely fair. The previous prime minister, Chamberlain, had thought he had negotiated peace with Hitler, had flown back to England waving a piece of paper and saying that he had guaranteed peace in our time. Turned out to be a complete lie, a complete sham, an exercise in vanity. And finally, he had to resign, and the king asked Churchill to form a government. But
And was
eh,
Mr. Churchill aware of and spoke about Mr. Chamberlain's naivete?
yes, yes, he was very very aware of his shortcomings and realized that vanity was the issue. Churchill was often vicious with his political opponents, as he needed to be. He once said of a man, he was a humble man with a lot to be humble about. This was typical of his rhetoric, and he spoke of Chamberlain respectfully to his face, but spoke of him being spineless behind his back, and that's the verdict of history.
The
So
verdict of
finally, the
history is that Neville Chamberlain may have been a polite and well-dressed man with a polite affect, but he was a fool. He was a naive fool. Now, that
yes.
doesn't mean he wasn't a nice human being and he didn't pet his dog and he wasn't polite to waiters and waitresses and he didn't dress nicely, but he was a polite, he was a naive fool. Is that a fair remark?
That's
Okay.
the majority opinion without question. It made it worse that he wore the bowler hat and had the aristocratic bearing, and he carried his umbrella, to negotiate with Hitler, and as though he was walking rainy London streets. He was classic British upper class at the time, very enamored of his own personal influence, very enamored of his own intelligence, and he thought he had saved England from devastation. He had just become a pawn in Hitler's game of devastation. And Churchill saw through it. Churchill saw through it.
And Churchill almost single-handedly saw through it, as the way history records it. Now, you're saying, Michael, there were other people who saw it, but they weren't as loud and as determined. Why does history place such a privilege on Hitler's foresight? Can you talk about that and who all saw through it?
I think that Hitler was not a man of great foresight. He was a man who knew how to play on a people's bitterness. World War I had devastated Germany. They'd had a horrible depression afterwards. Germany was blamed for World War I in a way that was, factually inaccurate. And the bitterness of the German people was stunning.
And
Churchill knew, I'm sorry,
the word humiliation,
yes, no
Germany
question,
was
absolutely.
humiliated.
Yes, yes, absolutely humiliated, and it tainted a generation. Bitter, suffering, a wheelbarrow of money would be required to buy a loaf of bread, devastated poverty. It was horrible, and the approbation of the world upon them because they had been blamed for World War II, which I'm sorry, World War I, which was not accurate. So what Hitler knew how to do was to use this bitterness as a force of his own ascent, and then, of course, turn it on the Jews and the other nations around Germany. And that's what caused the Germans to arise. They are amazingly gifted people. And so they were able to mechanize and mobilize very, very quickly and just overwhelmed the rest of Europe. And Churchill was not the only one who saw it, but he was the most articulate prophet, so to speak, and then he was handed the reins of power. Often the
Well,
people who foresee these things are still stuck in offices somewhere, but Churchill was actually handed the reins of power, which made all the difference.
and to say that Winston Churchill was articulate is like saying Michael Jordan was a good basketball player. He was the most articulate of all time, and he moved people with his words. And talk about his gift of oratory and how important that was.
Well, this is part of what attracts me to Churchill is knowing his personal history. I'll be brief with this, but Churchill was born with a stutter and had to overcome it. And he literally did the thing Demosthenes had done in the ancient world, and he overcame his lisp by quoting great speeches, but with a rock in his mouth, trying to form the words around the rock, getting his tongue disciplined. He did not do well in school. Famously, Churchill did not do well in school. He was bored. Nobody captured his imagination, but he was drawn to dramatic poetry. He once memorized 1,000 lines of Thomas Babington Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome, which is a very dense poem, won an award for it. So literature, words, rhetoric became the thing he loved because he wasn't good at the other aspects of academia. And then, of course, he was sent into the battlefield. Famously, he was at the last cavalry charge of the British Empire in northern Africa. He went to Cuba, etc. He was in what is now Pakistan. He got a lot of experience, but all the while he was training his mind, reading intently. So words and a mastery of language and putting language in the service of leadership and motivating others. This
There's
may
never
have
been
been
anyone
Churchill's
like him.
greatest gift. No,
There's,
very rarely. Very
yeah.
rarely.
And here let me say, let no one suggest that we British, have not at least as great an interest as the United States in the unflinching and relentless waging of war against Japan. And I am here to tell you that we will wage that war side by side with you in accordance with the best strategic employment of our forces while there is breath in our bodies and while blood flows in our veins. The African war is over. Mussolini's African empire and Corporal Hitler's strategy are alike exploding.
What we see in Ronald Reagan that we all admire, whether we're with him politically or not, his ability to communicate. This is a hint of what Churchill possessed: a combination of humor and high rhetoric and joy in the moment, and even using his own body and persona as a weapon of communication. All of it was very powerful.
Now, so was his humor.
Yes.
It's his humor. Madam Astor.
Yes.
Can you help me with a couple of these classics?
Well, the beauty of Churchill is that it wasn't just humor for humor's sake that he mastered. He knew how to communicate. Um, for example, here's one of my favorite stories. He was in the White House early in World War II. He was meeting with Roosevelt. Congress and others of the political set in DC suspected that Churchill was exaggerating what he needed from America in the war and asking for too much materiel, too high a price, that Churchill was hiding things. Churchill routinely took daytime baths. He was just emerging from a bath in the White House. The stewards wheeled Roosevelt into the room. There's Churchill, pink, wet, naked, standing there in front of his bath. Roosevelt, frustrated, an aristocrat, embarrassed at seeing Churchill naked. Churchill's got a towel around him. He said, Roosevelt starts saying, "Wheel me out, wheel me out." Churchill raises his hand and says, "No, Mr. President." And he pulls the towel away so that he's completely exposed. And he says, "I have nothing to hide from the President of the United States." So he's using his own body to send a message. Well, now Churchill knew that was going to be repeated often because he was going to be one of the main ones repeating it. And it passed around Congress and everybody was laughing at it so much, and they absorbed the message that Churchill maybe wasn't hiding anything. And he often did things like that. Another one of my favorites, if I may.
Dramatic.
Yes. Another one of my favorites, which is a little bit crass, just after World War II, there was a nationalization trend in British politics. The Labour Party wanted to nationalize all the industries. Well, Churchill was in Parliament. He was furious with this. He got up and left one of the debates and went to the men's room. It was the old men's room with the trough down the middle. So there he is, cigar in mouth, doing his business. And in walks the main proponent of nationalization. And so Churchill angrily walks to the other end of the trough at the far end of the room. And the champion of nationalization, Churchill's opponent, says, "Feeling standoffish today, Winston?" And Churchill growls, "No, but whenever you see anything big, you want to nationalize it." And he's making the point, you know. And again, that story gets repeated all throughout Parliament, brings the laugh. It's told in all the pubs, but it starts to turn the philosophy a little bit of the debate. So this was the genius of Winston Churchill.
Now, I want to understand that you said that many people did not recognize the threat of Hitler. Churchill certainly did. How was Stalin? Was Stalin sober about Hitler's threat, or no, he had to be convinced along with Roosevelt?
He had to be convinced along with Roosevelt. You see, many of them thought, well, Germany's been mistreated. Hitler may be a crazy man, but at least he's bringing the Germans back into some degree of pride and out of
The
the
trains run
humiliation.
on time, and
Yes, exactly, exactly. And we tend to excuse people who just make sure there's bread in the stores and the trains running on time. And you remember that Stalin's Russia was on the side of the Nazis initially in World War II.
yes, 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 that's
And so
accurate.
it wasn't until Hitler foolishly began to turn on Russia and began to basically invade Russia and move eastward, that Stalin changed his tune and began to appeal to the West. So yeah, the level of deception was pretty high, and Stalin played both sides, foolishly thinking that maybe he could make an alliance with Hitler, which of course never proved true.
In the modern world, the world of today, is there an adequate understanding among many of the core importance and lessons of Winston Churchill? I understand that our former President Biden and our former President Obama made the hard to understand, hard to believe decision of removing Winston Churchill's statue from the Oval Office, which of course Donald Trump returned and Bush returned. I mean, if somebody had come to me and said, "Mr. Levine, I have a thought. Maybe we should remove Winston Churchill's statue from the Oval Office," I'd say, "You're joking, right? I mean, are you ill? I mean, what? You're very unwell if you actually believe this." So, is there an adequate? Now, I understand that people differ and so forth and so on, but has the message and the importance of Winston Churchill carried forth adequately in today's modern world, or not especially?
The answer is absolutely not. And in fact, he's quite vilified today,
Who?
especially in academia. Part of it's
Like who?
neo-Marxism. Well, if for example, why let's ask ourselves, why did Mr. Obama remove Churchill's bust from the Oval Office? Well, he's from a Kenyan father. He identifies very much with a Kenyan background, and the Kenyans, of course, opposed the British. And so, if you are sort of in a neo-Marxist mode and you think in terms of history only as oppressors versus the oppressed, then you are easily able to see Churchill as symbolic of the oppression of the British Empire. And that's exactly why Mr. Obama removed Churchill's bust. You may
And
be
the
aware
same
that,
would be for political reasons, President Biden.
yes, no question about it. And
He
that's what
wanted to
we,
send a signal to his victim fans,
yes,
all of who think America is evil and we are poor, oppressed people, that Joe Biden's on the side of the poor, oppressed people and has nothing to do with the vile, evil. Mhm. It's really it is really hard to fully comprehend from a logical point of view. Emotionally, I guess one can understand it, but
sure.
yeah. All
Well,
right.
and this pervades university history faculties.
Oh,
It's a form of neo-Marxism. Who is the victim, the most popular victim right now? Uh, Again, Marxism sees history as oppressors and oppressed, and you're always choosing between the two. And that's exactly how Churchill is viewed now. The things that are laid at his door. There was a historian who went on a recent popular podcast and claimed that
saw this.
Churchill had killed more people than Hitler. I mean, how absurd. And as a result of that kind of thinking, we're losing the influence of Churchill in our other areas of life, which I
But
think is
Stephen,
tragic.
what you need to make clear to the audience is that when a man who is deranged says that, or just wants to be in the newspapers, that Churchill killed more people than Hitler. There are many, 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 many people 18 to 22 in universities who are young and impressionable, and they believe this rubble and this
Yes.
nonsense, and they begin a journey toward polluting their own mind. Now, 15 years later, these people become city managers, these people become attorneys, these people become other councilmen and women, school board members, and they take this utter insanity and they bring it forward as viable thought. And this is explains what's happened to much of the West in the last 20 years. Is that true?
I think that is true. The young come into the world with a bit of a gripe in their soul. All
Sure.
of us do it. We all did it at that age. And it kind of ticked off at our parents' generation and what's been handed to us. Well, what the academics do is they wed that dissatisfaction, that natural dissatisfaction of youth, to a historical philosophy that is anti-America, anti-Churchill, anti the good the West that has done. Basically,
Anti-Jewish, anti-Jewish.
anti-Jewish, very anti-Semitic, of course. I mean, we were all horrified at what was happening recently on the university campuses. But those of us who are there knows that that's what's being taught because Israel, believe it or not, in one of the great twists of history, is being viewed as an oppressor nation. Can you believe it? And so this is what's happened, and it's what's fueling a lot of the animosities towards Churchill, certainly, but also Israel in our generation.
So this is what Stephen has to offer as someone deeply familiar with American academia. When he and I and you see a congressional hearing a year ago with three women who were heads of elite universities, sounding like people who belong in an asylum, with the courage of whichever character in The Wizard of Oz did never the lion, the cowardly lion. I and the audience can't believe it. We just can't believe it. But you are saying, what's the surprise? This has been going on for 20 years.
Well, and that's the disconnect between the university and the average man in the street. It used to be that our universities were closer to real life. Uh, Towns had colleges and universities. There was an interplay between the two. But universities have become increasingly siloed in terms of their intellectual life. And so when we have an episode like the anti-Semitic riots on university campuses of late, suddenly Ma and Pa Kmart, and I say that with love, I come from that
Yeah.
family, um, are shocked to find out that
What? Yeah.
we were kind of undoing the war grandfather fought. Grandfather fought in part to liberate Jews in Europe. And now here we are, we're sending his grandchildren or great grandchildren to universities where the presidents don't seem to have any guts. The faculty are teaching anti-Semitism, and the students have absorbed it and gotten violent about it. And what's happened to America? But for those of us who are on those campuses, we know that this is percolating all the time. It's why we need to pay more attention to thought life and American culture and on the
Hey,
university campuses.
Stephen, let's be open with each other. You have properly labeled, articulately and properly labeled, the absolute indispensable element of academic life to this horror. No question. But, dear brother, kindergarten, high school, elementary school. Now, I'm going to tell you a story, and then we're going to end by giving the listeners some information about you. Stephen, this is a true story. In Orange County, California last year, that would be 2024, I was told by a father of two children, one 15, one 17, in high school, that approximately 50% of the students in these two children, they're in different grades, one's 15, one's 17. 50% of the students in Orange County, California in 2024 stood for the Pledge of Allegiance daily. The other half did not stand, faced no consequence. Right? Now, of the half that did stand, right, only half of the half that stood said the words of the Pledge of Allegiance. When asked why they stood and didn't say the words, they said, oh, it's not cool. I don't want to get in trouble. I'm scared. Now, think about that for a minute. If it's even half true, this is a very, very sick society currently. And anyway, do you have any comments on that?
Yes, I'm aware of that stat, and I'm certainly not humorously picking on California when I say that California has an extreme situation there throughout
Of
most of
course.
Middle
Well,
America
everyone
and the
knows that,
South.
Steve. Yeah.
Exactly,
This
exactly.
is not
But
happening in Kansas. We understand
exactly.
it.
Or the
Yeah.
South. But it is tragic. It is tragic. And again, I keep on using a phrase I don't want to take a lot of time to define, but neo-Marxism teaches us to think of the history as the chronicle of oppression.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so those kids who are sitting down have probably been told by their parents that America oppresses them, stole their land, takes their rights from them, is an evil force. So they're not going to stand up and pledge allegiance to its flag. Then, of course, you're going to have those caught in the middle who don't want to be, beat up
And the
or
school does
criticized.
nothing. If, I think back to my elementary school years, and maybe you do as well with yours. If you didn't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, you would not be invited to spend the rest of the afternoon in Mrs. McGillicuddy's class. I promise you that.
Well,
That would eliminate.
I can take it a step further. I grew up a military brat going to
Okay.
Department of Defense schools. I can
Okay.
assure you the football team
Yeah.
was going to make sure everybody
Yeah.
stood in the next morning's
Yes.
class.
Yes.
So
Yes. And by the
yeah, it was
way,
a bit.
if people feel so inclined to not want to stand, right, then they should remove themselves from the classroom.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
If you really believe, as you indicate, that I choose not to stand for this vile civilization, great. Leave the classroom. Go find a
Well,
school.
yes. And this fact ought to be discussed and debated in the state legislature. They ought to see it as an indicator of a cancer that's growing among
Well,
our
in
young and
California,
address it.
friend, in California, the legislator would hear this story and say, "What's wrong with that?
Exactly.
Why do so many people stand?" They
Yeah,
would be upset that 50% stood.
right.
So anyway, Stephen, now people have just been listening to you speak brilliantly and interestingly and provocatively, and I want to know how people all over the world can get more information on you, learn more. I believe, correct me here if I'm wrong, you've written a book on Churchill. Is that accurate?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Tell us the
Yeah,
name of that book, dear friend.
Leader in time of crisis is what it's called.
Okay.
Churchill, leader in time of crisis. People can get in touch with me by going to stephenmansfield.tv, and Stephen is spelled with a PH, the only way that ought to be legal, by the way. Stephenmansfield.tv. And all of my other media, Twitter, I mean, X and so on, is all Mansfield Writes as one word. Just Mansfield Writes is my handle on X and so on.
And
And
they can learn all about you and the books and the so forth.
exactly. Exactly.
Stephen, we're going to say goodbye. And this has been a real treat for me. I've learned a lot and confirmed a lot. What is it, as a parting shot, that you would like to share with the world that they don't know that they need to know about Winston Churchill? What is the central thing that would help them? What book, beyond your own, of course they should read yours, what book should they read? How should they better acquaint themselves with the absolute heroic central importance of Winston Churchill in the 20th century?
Well, it's a great question. Churchill was such a great writer himself that I recommend his books. And the best introduction to his life is his own book, My Early Life, where he's describing his upbringing and sufferings and arrest in South Africa during the Boer War and all of that kind of thing. And then, of course, read my book. There are lots of other great books out there. But the main thing I would want people to know is that Winston Churchill was a man who had absolute flaws, much suffering in his life, haunted by his father who hated him most of his days, et cetera, et cetera. But he was a man who believed in the nobility of freedom. He was a man who believed in the nobility of democratic institutions, and he contended for those in a very dark time with bombs falling around his head. And I believe that we should not be discouraged by our times, but believe, given his example, that we can make a similar difference if we are equally committed to the things he was committed to, flawed though we may be, like he was. And that's why I like Winston Churchill so much. The average kid struggling through school can read his story and be inspired to greatness. And we've got to have a rekindling of greatness in our time. And I think Churchill can certainly help us with that and take us there.
We've been very blessed to have you, Stephen. You are an absolute outstanding surrogate for Mr. Churchill here today. And thank you for your time and for your honesty, your candor, and your humor. It's also
Well,
enjoyable.
Michael, what a privilege. Thank you so much. You've been very kind, and it's been a joy to be with you.
Well, friends, I did promise you a life-changing experience, and I think Stephen more than delivered. Friends, my invitation to you is simple. If you have not read a book in your entire life on Winston Churchill, may I beg you, for you, not for me, to read one of these books, whether they be by Stephen or by Winston Churchill himself, any other historical records. The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, of course, is a great book. Friends, you owe this to your life, to yourself, to your growth, to your understanding of the world. And I'm so happy that Stephen was able to join us today, because I think we made a modest contribution into inviting people who may not be fully aware of Winston Churchill into a richer understanding of who the most important man of the 20th century was. Thank you so much for joining us on Without Notes, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode.